So, welcome to all of you. Welcome to the BSR ICS, the Institute of Classical Studies, joint lecture. I'll pass first of all to Greg Wolfe, who is going to talk through the idea behind the series, and then we'll come back to the actual talk tonight.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everybody. It's very nice to have this event happen again this year, despite all the obstacles. We've been running them since, I think, for about 8 or 9 years. My predecessor, John North, set up the exchange. And the idea was that since we're both research institutes that are all about making connections across Europe, among researchers and among people interested in research, it would make sense for the Institute of Classical Studies, which is part of the School of Advanced Study in London, and the BSR, which is a BIRI Institute, to join forces. And every year, we have been inviting a leading archaeologist or scholar who works on Italian material to come and speak in London. We've had some amazing people, Rita Volpe, Gabriele Zutriegel, and others in recent years. And then every year, the school invites somebody who we suggest as somebody who's doing really important cutting-edge research within the UK, but of a kind that we think will be of interest to an international audience. It's worked very well, and we've sent a series of very distinguished people across: Michael Crawford, John North, Roy Gibson, Catherine Edwards, and really pleased.
And you yourself.
And indeed myself. And we're really pleased that Penny Goodman has agreed to take this on this year. It's a really great exchange. It's a bit strange to do it virtually, but with luck next year, it'll all be happening in the flesh once again, both in Bloomsbury and in Rome. Okay,
and we really do hope it's going to happen in the flesh next year, but you all know about the nature of these hopes at the moment. Anyway, on Penny. Penny Goodman is an associate professor in Roman history at the University of Leeds, and she's written extensively on Roman urbanism, particularly the relationship between urban space and social interactions inside the urban community. She's published The Roman City and Its Periphery, a monograph on the periphery, and articles about location of temples, location of workshops, the boundaries of the city of Rome. I think I'd single out, apart from the Roman City and Its Periphery, which is an important text, she published in the papers of the British School at Rome an article on the 14 regions of Rome last year. This last calendar year. So this is very new and interesting. And I'd also single out her edited volume, The Afterlives of Augustus. 2,000 years of the afterlives of Augustus up to 2014, although they didn't come out until 2018. Penny's been very interested in the reception of Augustus from his death to the present day. And she's actually currently working on that reception, a monograph examining activities, events to herald the bimillennia of Augustus's birth in 1938 and his death in 2014, which are very large scale and very different forms of engagement with Augustus in the last century. And I suppose, the Augustus show in Paris was more recently 2014, wasn't it? But it must have been part of the same sequence.
It was 2014, actually.
It was
yeah.
It's just that time goes by. It just seems like the other year. But anyway, she's got the Commemorating Augustus website, which it is worth looking at. And her title, Thinking About Encroachment in the Cities of the Roman West. I think this is really important. This has been dealt with so stupidly in the past by people who talk about crisis and decay. And I have a fair feeling that Penny is going to talk about this in very, very different ways. And I really want to know how she's going to talk. Right, so she's just about to talk. It's important to say to all of you, this event is being recorded. And as to questions, all of us are going to be muted and our pictures cancelled. including Greg and myself. How you ask questions is through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please don't attempt to use any other function. There's not much point in raising hands when we can't see you. And on this particular interface, there isn't a chat line. So just the Q&A function. And then I will be taking the questions at the end. And I promise you that I actually will take them, although sometimes you'll be asking the same question and I'll be picking probably the first one I see. But that's how we will do it. But we'll do that at the end. And in the meantime, over to you, Penny, and I will mute myself and cancel.
Okay, thank you ever so much, Chris, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to Greg and to Harriet as well for arranging this event and for the invitation. I consider it a great honour. Obviously, I would slightly have preferred to be in Rome rather than in Leeds with melting snow outside in the garden, but it's really great to be able to speak to this audience. So let me get my screen share happening. Okay, hopefully people can now see my PowerPoint, and I'll trust somebody to tell me if that isn't the case. I'll assume you can. Good, okay. Thank you very much for letting me know. Okay, so yeah, as Chris said, I would like to speak to you today about encroachments in the cities of the Roman West. I'd actually like to start by showing you a picture of a property boundary in Leeds. Here we go. It happens to be the boundary between my own house and that of my neighbours. On the left, you've got the land registry diagram showing the legally registered plot boundaries, which, as you can see, are straight lines. In reality, the fence between the two properties actually has a distinct curve in it. If you're struggling to pick that out, let me just help by putting red dots on the on the top of the fence post. So I hope you can see a bit of a curve going on in the fence there. So at some point between the property boundaries being defined in the land registry and the reality of now, a discrepancy has arisen between the records and reality. Now, I suspect that in this case, it was probably really just a case of shoddy fence building. But people do this deliberately as well, moving boundaries a little bit here, a little bit there, in order to appropriate land which isn't legally theirs. In English, we normally call this encroachment. And encroachment seems to be a fairly standard feature of any society that recognises land ownership. Where we have the historical information to tell us, we can usually see that it was going on. In antiquity, it clearly happened in the countryside all the time. And that's why people celebrated the Terminalia in the way Ovid describes here. They ritually revisited their boundaries every year with their neighbours. And that was a way of ensuring that everybody was clear about where the boundaries ran. And that would make it socially difficult to get away with encroachment. As well, in the work of the agrimensores, these are full of instructions on how to recognise boundary markers in the countryside and what to do in case of boundary disputes. There are also two substantial sections in the digest that also deal with rural property encroachment. So in the archaeological record, it isn't always very easy to identify rural property boundaries or to detect where they've changed. It's easier in an urban environment where you've got more concrete boundaries, such as walls in use. And indeed, there's another whole body of legislation dealing with urban encroachment as well. And we'll look at that in a moment. First of all, on the topic of urban encroachment, these are some of the publications which have looked at this topic as a matter of scholarship, working either with archaeological examples or legal texts or both. But what characterises these publications is almost all of them are focused primarily on late antiquity. For earlier periods, encroachment did happen, and archaeologists quite often apply the term to individual sites, but it's rarely discussed as a sort of general phenomenon of Roman urbanism. That is, the examples are not really brought together and thought about as a set. So I think that's a pity, because looking at encroachment can tell us a lot about urban communities. It reveals a lot about the power dynamics, about the pressures on space. It presents us with interesting challenges as well, like how does the thinking in the legal texts relate to the archaeological examples? And how can we work out what the conflicts and the negotiations might have been around a particular boundary change that we can see archaeologically? So I want to think in this paper about how we can build that phenomenon of encroachment into our understanding of Roman urbanism in the High Empire. And I hope as well that it's an exploration which should be worthwhile for scholars of late antiquity too, because looking at these publications on the slide, I think scholars of late antiquity have been on a journey where their starting point was that encroachment reflected the declining power of local authorities, and is therefore characteristic of a late antique context. And it took them quite a long time to sort of get from there to realize that actually it happens the most, even in late antiquity, in cities which remained populous and dynamic, and that there actually could be some quite good reasons why local councils would want to agree to it. And I think that's a thought process which might have happened a bit faster if the earlier and the later examples had been brought together from the start. I want to try to reflect a little bit as well on the vocabulary that's used around encroachment. So in the publications that I've got here, I tried to kind of pull out what the major key words are that authors use to describe this phenomenon. So these are what I came up with from the different language traditions. But we can already see from this slide that people are looking at the phenomenon from different angles. So Italians are thinking about property abuses, which is a form of behavior. Germans seem to be thinking primarily about streets being blocked, which is an outcome. And then the English and the French words encroachment and empiètement both evoke something that's done in a sort of creeping, tentative, illicit manner. But I think those connotations get people into knots when they're dealing with examples which are actually pretty blatant, or we're clearly done with the permission of local authorities. In Latin legal texts dealing with encroachment, a whole range of verbal phrases come up. And we can see that these verbal phrases and the actions that they describe, that people thought of these actions as connected because they occur either within the same laws or within groups of rulings which are gathered together in the same parts of the legal corpuses. But this very wide range of terms in Latin does tip us off that applying a single word like encroachment, as English speakers do, might actually be a bit reductive. So in the paper that follows, I'm looking at encroachment. I'm going to focus specifically on encroachment onto streets and city walls rather than between private properties. I'm doing that because streets and city walls were clearly meant to remain unimpeded when they were built. So that's inherent in the nature of them. So when we see them being encroached on, we know that something has changed in the control and use of that space. I'm also going to be focusing on cities in the Western Empire, primarily just because that's the part I know best. I don't mean to imply by doing that that the same thing wasn't happening in the eastern part of the empire at the same time. Okay, so starting by looking at encroachment in legal and literary texts, these certainly confirm that it wasn't okay, at least in theory, and that encroachment onto public space was a particular concern. And they also provide some insights into who might take a stance against it and what that involved. So for city walls, the legal situation was pretty unambiguous. They were subject to divine protection, and that meant they were not to be built upon or breached. That was clearly a pretty consistent position over time. So these rulings on the slide were chosen for inclusion in the digest, but they go back at least to Julio-Claudian precedents. You can see that in the second example. The fourth ruling here also includes a direct reference to the story of Romulus and Remus. Obviously, that's a non-legal way of reinforcing the same norms. So the norms are clear, But in spite of this, we'll see that walls were definitely encroached upon. There's also a large body of late antique legislation dealing with encroachment onto other public spaces or monuments. So these are just the main places where those groups of laws occur in the corpuses. There's absolutely loads of them. And of course, the fact there were so many confirms that encroachment was common behavior, because you only ban something if it's happening. The way they're collected into these sections of the digest and the codices as well confirms that they were, the issue was understood, and these laws were all understood as relating to a sort of related shared phenomenon. I'm going to go through 3 examples of specific laws just to sort of exemplify what's there, primarily coming from the late antique period at this point and reflecting different stances. So first we have Julian in a ruling applicable to any city. This law takes quite a relaxed position, which is basically that if somebody builds something, as long as that person doesn't harm the city, then they should be thankful that it's been adorned. But the way that it's phrased does leave quite a lot of room for case-by-case judgment, because obviously a lot hangs on the definition of whether this building harms the city or not, and on who has the social status within the community to define that. Next law is specifically about Constantinople, and its main drift is that people whose houses have usurped porticos or shut off alleyways should take them away and restore to the city its rights. But even this law as well specifies that all this only applies to people who are without the authorization of an imperial rescript. So that gives us some insight into the sort of social networks by which people might be allowed to block public space. It's something that by implication is open to those with access to the emperor. The reference to a fine of £50 of gold as well indicates that this is aimed at the actions of the wealthy elite who might respond to that kind of fine. Third law, final example, it's also specific to Constantinople, and this one articulates a pretty hard line. It seems to be directed at a different kind of structure this time, not elite properties, but some kind of flimsy shed or lean-to, and these are supposed to be torn down and destroyed according to this law. But even the emperors passing this law seem to be anticipating potential objections to the removal of whatever these structures were, because they've gone to quite some trouble to justify the idea that it needs to be done. They're talking about these structures causing a dread of fire or ambushes and narrowing the width of the streets. So from that quick look at the late antique laws, we've got a situation where on a simple level, encroachment is not allowed, and people like emperors and urban prefects did try to control it and act against it. But there is a lot of room around the edges of these laws for negotiation and compromise, particularly for the wealthy elite. So these laws mainly reflect their late antique climate. You can see that in factors like Julian evoking the idea of gratitude when people build anything at all. There's also things like a whole subset of laws dealing with temples, which are initially preserved as heritage monuments and then specifically excluded from any protection. But there are plenty of earlier laws as well, which also forbid encroachment. So the Tabula Heracliensis, which is Caesarian, is concerned with people building in, possessing or blocking public places in the city of Rome, areas, arcades, streets, porticos, etc. Again, with this law though, there's scope for negotiation built into it from the start, because the final line goes on to refer to this being all except for people to whom permission has been granted. And it goes on to give examples of people in that situation. It's people like the censors when they're putting out public contracts, and situations where games are being held or to house public slaves. So we have a similar situation. Encroachment is banned, except for lots of sort of caveats. Similarly, we can look at the Urso Charter. It's also Caesarean legislation. And this sought to prevent people from blocking roads and also ditches anywhere in the territory of the colony of what's now called Urso. And it specifies that if they're blocked, a fine is to be paid to the colony. But this one specifies that it's up to any person, so qui wallet, to bring a suit against somebody who's broken this law. Now, that may not have applied in all contexts, because in other laws and inscriptions, we do have references to magistrates acting in cases where streets are narrowed or blocked. But this tells us that this could be the framework in at least some contexts. And where this sort of thinking applied, it would mean that acting against encroachment carried a cost in terms of effort, time, money for an individual person who might want to do it. And that, of course, would be a strong incentive to turn a blind eye. It means that anybody who did act against encroachment must have had the resources to do so and have felt strongly about it. For the local council at Urso, where that fine was levied against the case of encroachment, obviously that would constitute some income. So that might be an incentive for a local councillor to launch the lawsuit against the offender. But also accepting encroachment retrospectively might benefit local councils in other ways. There might be an extra property or a more profitable business which they could tax. And certainly the late antique legislation includes some cases where encroachment was allowed to stand in return for the builder paying a tax to the local authorities. Leaving the legal sources behind, there's a range of texts which suggest that emperors particularly liked to position themselves as the guarantors of the public realm who would protect it against private encroachment. And that's part of their general position as the protectors of the people. It's essentially what Augustus did when he bought up private houses on the Palatine to turn the area over to public use and build the Temple of Apollo. And it's certainly what Vespasian did when he built the Colosseum over the remains of the Domus Aurea. So those are the big programmatic imperial projects, but they also sit alongside a lot of more modest inscriptions, all from Rome and all from the 1st century of the Principate, which talk about restoring the space from private holders into public hands. So on the slide, I put a fairly typical example, and the verb restituit there certainly implies that the space had originally been public and was being restored to its proper condition by the emperor. These inscriptions usually also define an area of space from one kippus to the next, and that would serve to show the extent of the achievement of the emperor, the amount of space he'd restored, and it would provide a measurement against which any future encroachment could be identified. Two of the Augustan examples, so those two that I've just put in the box, refer to a more specific archaeological context. And that's a paved area shown by the arrow here on the Esquiline Hill. So there was a statue base of Mercury shown in the picture, which was rebuilt and dedicated by Augustus in 10 BC. So you have there a very Augustan restoration of a neighborhood religious monument. And because two of these restitution inscriptions were found very nearby, close to that base, it looks like there was a sort of associated restoration of public space around the statue base itself. Perhaps this paved area which Lanciani recorded around the altar. So that sort of behavior by emperors like Augustus, it's in line with the late antique emperors who appear acting against encroachment in the legal sources. But obviously emperors are exceptional in their access to resources and their desire to present themselves as protectors of the people. We can't expect to see that kind of behavior everywhere. and especially in cases like, as the Urso Charter showed, where it might be up to private individuals to bring legal cases against encroachment. Okay, so we've looked at the texts. Now let's have a look at some archaeological examples. Here's a map of the examples that I'm going to show you. And they're all places where at least somebody has referred to the site I'm going to discuss using the vocabulary of encroachment that I set out earlier. They encompass a range of different scenarios, as we'll see, some that seem to have been permitted by the local authorities, at least one which probably was not, and perhaps one case where the encroachment was actually overturned. So we'll start in North Africa with Timgad. So here, obviously, the dating evidence is very poor because Timgad was uncovered in clearance excavations in the late 19th and 20th centuries. But it's got a good epigraphic record, and that provides some dates and some information about the personalities and agendas at work. So there's lots of structures at Timgad which seem to encroach onto the streets or the walls. To take the two examples here, the Great East Baths cover what seem to have been originally 4 separate city blocks at Timgad. And an inscription was found within those baths dated to AD 167, which refers, I'll put the Latin on the slide, to them as baths which were extended or enlarged in some way. So that's the inscription dates to AD 167. That may be when the 4 city blocks were brought together and the streets were therefore covered over. But we can't actually relate that inscription directly to the archaeological sequence because we only have the latest phase there. In the southwest corner, the house of Certius, sits entirely over a demolished section of the city wall. And several different inscriptions confirm that the owner of that house also paid for the markets. That's it. That's where I wanted to be. He also paid for the market at the west gate of the city and probably the Capitolium, although that's not quite certain because the inscription which suggests that was found out of context. So it's possible that Certius was given permission by the local council to demolish a whole section of the city wall and build over it. And he was allowed to claim some of that space for his own house as a sort of perk connected with his nearby benefactions. So that gives us some insights into the sort of social networks that might be at work around an elite benefactor. But the library at Timgad perhaps reveals the most about how these cases could occur. So there's the location in the middle of the city. And here is a plan and the dedicatory inscription of the library. That inscription probably dates to the early 3rd century AD, although that's only on the basis of style and wording. So on the plan, we can see the library encroached by 3 meters onto the 2 side streets to the north and the south, and that required the paving of those streets to be relaid. And it also encroached by 1.5 meters into the street at the back. The inscription tells us that Rogatianus, who was a native of Timgad and who we know from other sources was a senator, left this library to the city in his will, but the work was completed by the res publica after his death. Presumably in practice, that means the city council. So that detail means that in the case of this library, we can be confident that they knew about and were complicit in the encroachment of the streets around the project. Even if the whole thing was planned out by Rogatianus before his death, they finished it. So they were obviously willing for the encroachment to happen. And so again, we've got a case where this definitely reflects the workings of elite social networks. We've got a wealthy, politically influential member of the community who obviously wanted to be remembered through this impressive benefaction. The local councillors are his peer group, and they might have ongoing social connections with his networks even after his death. They would certainly want their city to look splendid, and they might wish for favours like this to be extended to them in the future. So all those interests come together, and we can deduce that they encourage both sides to feel that a little bit of street encroachment was worthwhile in return for the personal and collective prestige that this project would give them. So we seem to have a fairly solid case of council approved encroachment at Timgad, and that gives us some proxies for what that might look like, which we could apply elsewhere where we don't have an inscription like this to confirm it. Obviously, this is a highly visible and prestigious building, which cost a lot of money. We can see the sum on the inscription. So we probably, even without the inscription, could have guessed that the local council must have approved this library, because you couldn't do something like this without people noticing. And most people wouldn't want to invest this amount of money into a building if they were not confident that it wasn't going to be torn down by the local council. We might notice as well that it only blocks sort of side and back streets, not the main street at the front of the library, which ran from the city gate to the forum. So the community's collective interest in keeping that road unimpeded has been respected. However, the library does block the colonnaded pavement along that side of the street. So here are a couple of pictures which show that. We're looking along the colonnade here, and the bulk of the library directly blocks it off. And we can see from the street here as well, the way the steps up to the library interface directly with the street paving. So that would mean somebody who'd be walking along that colonnade would have to step into the road to get past the library. Obviously, for the local council here, they didn't feel that was a problem. Maybe it was even desirable as a way of really making sure that that building was visible. Okay, our next stop is Pompeii. So here I want to talk about two main topics, which are the ambiguity of pavement space, which is something that's just come up as well with the Timgad Library, and the factors which cause some parts of the walls at Pompeii to become almost completely engulfed by private houses and not others. So we'll start with the pavements first of all. So we know that at Rome, property owners were responsible for maintaining the pavement in front of their properties, subject to the overall oversight of the aediles. At Pompeii, Jeremy Hartnett has shown that property owners quite often made their own embellishments to pavements. So not just restoring them, which they were charged with doing, but going beyond that, constructing raised sections, ramps, benches, etc. So that probably reflects a similar legal situation. And of course, a legal situation like that immediately creates an ambiguity over who has the right to control and make changes to pavement space. So at one site, the end result seems to have been that the pavement was engulfed entirely. This is the Temple of Fortuna Augusta, inaugurated in AD 3. So here the dedicatory inscription at the bottom tells us that it was built by a Marcus Tullius on his own land and with his own money. And a second inscription as well, just at the side of the temple, obviously marks out where the temple space ended and Tullius's remaining private property began after the construction of the temple. So that's the area privata. So the site of the temple was reinvestigated in 2011 to 12 by a team from the École Française de Rome, and they confirmed that basically what the inscription says is true. The temple plot had previously been occupied by shops and a house, so presumably that was Tullius's private property, which he turned over to the temple. But as well as it using up his private property that had been part of his house, the temple sort of went a bit extra and clearly extended over the pavement in front of the property, and indeed it sticks out into the street as well. So we can see that clearly from this aerial view. There's the temple, and one sort of way to gauge what had happened is to look at this colonnade, across the front of what obviously remained Tullius's private property. So this column, just highlighted with the arrow, was reconfigured in order to match a column at the other end of the colonnade. So we can deduce that that column was not originally an end column. It was reconfigured to become an end column. That would suggest that that colonnade had been truncated and that originally it extended right across the front of Tullius's property up to the street corner. So that gives us an idea of where the pavement originally ran, allowing us to see that the temple encroached not only onto the pavement, but also stuck out into the line of the street. So that project would have been highly visible again, like the library at Timgad while it was going on. And again, the local council is implicated in it because this was a public city cult. From AD 3 onwards, the council appointed official slave ministry to tend to the cult. Tullius himself as well was part of the city council. He held all the highest offices in Pompeii, and he was a tribunus militum a populo, which would have been bestowed on him by Augustus. So he has a connection with the emperor. So we can basically put that temple alongside the library at Timgad. Both projects financed by a prominent member of the local elite with links to the emperor or the senate. Both enhance the appearance of the city, and in both cases, the local council has clearly been actively involved and must have approved this encroachment. Turning to the walls at Pompeii, there's a lot of encroachment onto these. What I want to pick out is what happens in different parts of the walled circuit. So first, let's take a look at the walls themselves. We've got here a phase diagram showing the walls through time. And what we really want to look at is the final phase labelled with E, which is what the walls looked like by the time of the Sullan siege at Pompeii in the 1st century BC. So we've got an external and an internal curtain wall with a walkway in between them and a rampart behind. Now, it's very clear that not long after the Sullan siege at Pompeii, the Roman colonists who took charge of the city made the decision to allow buildings to cut into the internal ramparts behind the walls. We can see that at the amphitheatre, which was built in 70 BC by 2 duoeri, and which uses the internal ramparts to support its seating. So that's definitely a council-approved project. By 50 BC, houses had started encroaching onto the rampart as well. So here is the House of the Vestals. It's situated just within the walls. They run along the back of the property, so you've got the wall and the rampart. Around 50 BC, the House of the Vestals was extended backwards. It cut into the rampart to do that. So the walls of that extension are to a certain extent terraced walls holding back the earth. Here is an aerial view. So the arrow marks the extension we've just seen. But along the rest of that stretch, the rampart remains unaffected. The other houses haven't done this. And that's a strong contrast with the western section of the walls, which we can see here, and also the southern section further along. Here on the west, almost every house has extended right over the walls and well beyond them. So let's look at the southwest corner of the walls. Here we go. So the houses in this corner of Pompeii were dubbed Hanghäuser by Noack and Lehman Hartelben in the 1930s because of the way they hang over the walls. And the most common explanation that's given for the phenomenon is that owners in this corner of Pompeii wanted to have views out of the city over the sea, because that's the direction in which the sea lies. And I'm sure that that's true, but that only explains these people's motivation to build out over the walls in this way. There's also another factor to take into account, which is that the design of the walls in this corner of Pompeii made doing this not just desirable, but also quite easy. And the key to it actually lies in the contour lines, which we can see on this plan. The walls in this corner of Pompeii were not the same as around the rest of the city. They didn't have an internal rampart. In fact, they were essentially terracing walls running along the top of the slope represented by the contour lines. Rather than having an internal rampart, they actually basically supported a fill, which evened out the edges of the plateau, creating more habitable space on the inside. So I can show that best in relation to the corner that I've just marked with the arrow. And we'll now look at that corner in 3D. So just in this corner, there's a stretch of wall with columns embedded into it, which Ivo van der Graaf has identified as part of the original battlement on the walls of Pompeii. And you can tell because there's a triangular arrow slit cut into the wall. That means that the street running just inside that bit of battlement must once have basically been the battlement walk at the top of the walls. And van der Graaf has argued, though, that it must basically already have become not a battlement walk, but an urban street by the 2nd century BC, because that's when these columns were embedded into it, making it decorative rather than functional. So if we've identified that street as being on the level of the battlement walk, we've got a situation where all the houses in this part of Pompeii have their entrances and their ground floors basically at the same level as the battlement walk along the top of the city walls. And that's why it was so easy for them to engulf the walls. So just next to this corner is the house of Marcus Fabius Rufus, which has recently been reinvestigated by a team led by Mario Grimaldi and Umberto Pappalardo. So here are some images of that house. This is actually the biggest house in Pompeii, created by combining several neighbouring properties. And Grimaldi et al. Believe that it was already overhanging the city wall, which you can see the wall itself here. So it was already kind of overhanging that wall and using it to create pleasant terraces with a view by the middle of the 1st century BC. At some point, that actually included lowering the section of city wall by comparison with what survived in the neighbouring properties. And the major period of expansion for this house beyond the city walls was AD 40 to 62, and that's when a kind of porticoed garden was installed outside the walled circuit. So if we put the house of Fabius Rufus next to the house of the Vestals, there we go, we can see what difference the design of the walls made. If the owner of the house of the Vestals had wanted to extend beyond the wall, they would have had to dig out the whole of the rampart and demolish the curtain wall. But for the owner of the house of Fabius Rufus, it was really just a question of building up to the wall and then spilling over it. So that made life easier. And it's why I think that although these sea views were definitely important for the houses in the southwest corner of Pompeii, we shouldn't forget about these simple kind of practical factors when thinking about this example and other examples of encroachment. It's not just going to occur where it was desirable or where the local authorities permitted it, but also where the topography made it easy. Before we finish with Pompeii, I just want to note that there's also a series of inscriptions here, similar to the ones at Rome, 4 of them in total, all located outside the city gates and all bearing the same text. So they attest that a tribune called Suedius Clemens, acting on the authority of the Emperor Vespasian, restored public space to the res publica of Pompeii, which had become possessed by private persons. And he did it by examining the causes and taking measurements. So although these inscriptions are located immediately outside gates in the city walls, they can't be talking about the private encroachment onto the walls that we've just seen, because there was no sign of any attempt to remove that. I think probably a more natural interpretation is because you would see them as you were going into the city, entering the gate, they probably refer to actions that applied all over the urban centre that you were about to enter. Obviously, the timing in the reign of Vespasian means that they post-date the AD 62 earthquake. So we could quite easily imagine that the sort of disturbance and debris that the earthquake created might have created a situation where people thought they could get away with trying to appropriate space that they weren't entitled to. Obviously, with this example, like the inscriptions from Rome, it takes an emperor to sort this out. So we've got an exceptional intervention in response to exceptional circumstances. And I think it's noticeable as well that Suedius Clemens's sphere of concern doesn't seem to extend to encroachment onto private property. He's only concerned with restoring public places into public hands. So again, that might mean that it was up to individuals at Pompeii to launch civil suits if they thought their own property had been encroached. Okay, next let's go to Caerwent in South Wales. So here the important road in this settlement is the east-west road. That links to the legionary fortress to the west and basically the whole of the rest of Britain to the east. In fact, many people have suggested that Caerwent basically originated as a ribbon development along that road before it was constituted into a civitas capital and had an orthogonal grid put in place. As at Timgad, the main excavations here were early 20th century clearance. So while we've got this lovely extensive plan, and we can pick out a lot of examples of encroachment by eye, in most cases, we don't have much information about the phases of development. However, where you've got a site that's coloured brown on this plan, that was either excavated or re-excavated more recently, and some of those provide better chronological detail. The main area I want to look at is in the middle of the city. So if we zoom in, we've got the Forum Basilica facing onto the main east-west road, and one block to the east is what, in its final phase, was a Romano-Celtic temple next to a row of strip buildings facing onto the main road. And here we have got lovely chronological sequences, thanks to re-excavation in the 1980s by Richard Brewer. So looking at the temple site, he's actually provided a phased plan of that. And you can get your orientation between the different stages of this plan by looking at the white patches in the sort of stippled grey patches around the edges of the early phases. So what you're looking at there is parts of the original metalled street surface between this site and the Forum, which couldn't be excavated because they were underneath the cella of the later Romano-Celtic temple. So basically you can see the footprint of the cella in the original street metalling in the earlier phases of this site. So the earliest structure here, built in the late 1st or early 2nd century AD, was a timber strip building, probably with a commercial function. It was renewed at least once in its lifetime, probably in the Hadrianic period. And already in that phase, we can see an extension to the south of about 3 meters onto the metalled street surface. A second encroachment happens in the mid-2nd century. So the timber buildings are now replaced with stone, and an open yard is added to the west. And the phase 3 picture is directly aligned with the one above it for phase 1. So you can see how far the yard is extended. It's about 5 meters out into the street between this site and the Forum Basilica. That building was then renewed twice. It doesn't change radically during those renewals, but in phase 4, it does seem to involve fully enclosing what before was a kind of open area. Then obviously the big change happens in the early 4th century. At that point, a 1 meter deep layer of clay was spread over all the earlier buildings. The strip building was reconstructed more or less where it was, but now the Romano-Celtic temple was added, filling in most of what had been the yard and extending again another 5 meters into the street to the west. Going back to the wider context, If we extrapolate what we learned from the Romano-Celtic temple site to the rest of the block, we can guess that the original boundary for that block looked something like this. And that would mean the original distance between the southwest corner of the block and the Forum Basilica was actually 18 meters. And that's unusually wide for a Roman street. At Pompeii, they are 4.5 meters, the widest streets, and at Timgad, they are 5. Now that might give us one reason why nobody ever seems to have objected to the encroachment here. Even after the Romano-Celtic temple was built, the distance between it and the Forum Basilica still was 8 meters. That's still wider than Pompeii or Timgad, and it would have allowed 2 carts to pass. So the traffic here was never impeded. We can also see, following from that corner, that the other strip buildings to the east of the Romano-Celtic temple have clearly encroached out towards the main road too. We don't actually know which one might have done it first because we only have the dating for the one at the western end of the row. But certainly they've all ended up at least in alignment with the facade of the temple, and some even a little bit further to the south than that. In fact, we could imagine a sort of encroachment arms race going on here, in that once one of those strip buildings had pushed forward, the neighbours are going to want to do that as well, so that they aren't kind of in the shadows of the buildings which have already extended. And this is probably another example as well of the vulnerability of pavement space that we've seen at Timgad and at Pompeii. That's something that's certainly a good reason to believe was often caused by shops. There is a famous epigram, whoops, sorry, wrong way. There we go. There's a famous epigram from Martial praising Domitian for clearing the goods out of the streets at Rome. And there is legislation in the digest as well, which forbids people to leave things outside workshops. Indeed, street display is something that modern shopkeepers do as well to help attract the attention of their customers. And there's a nice scene from HBO's Rome as well, helping us to imagine what it might have looked like with tables and counters outside the front of the shop itself. Going back to that Romano-Celtic temple site, certainly if this building was commercial from the start, pushing out to the south and then also to the west would make sense, because those are frontages which probably had a lot of footfall. It's pushing out into the main east-west road and then also into the road on the other side of which is the Forum. So we can imagine quite easily that here the first shopkeeper might have laid their goods out onto the pavement, then maybe they build some kind of awning or portico to shelter them. Once that's happened for a couple of decades, there's an established precedent and a more permanent structure can be built. The yard that's added in stage 3 is a pretty definitive enclosure of the space. But even that still represents a fairly modest investment in terms of the materials to do it. So first, the owner could argue they've been doing it for decades, it's only upgrading a temporary structure. But secondly, if they are asked to remove the structure, it's not a huge disaster. So while I think the Romano-Celtic temple is obviously different and goes alongside the examples at Timgad and at Pompeii, the temple, I think, must have been approved and agreed to by the city council. I think the earlier phases on this site at Caerwent, are a fairly plausible, convincing example to me of some more tentative, sort of illicit, gentle push and creep and appropriation of space. So we've seen a range of examples now, some pretty clearly allowed by local authorities. This one at Caerwent that I think was perhaps more illicit, but the literary and legal texts also sometimes refer to encroachments being removed. So can we see any examples of that in the archaeological record? I've only managed to find one that's been interpreted in that way, and I had to go to late antiquity to get it. It's from Bularegia in Tunisia and relates to the insula marked with the red rectangle here. and specifically to the house known as the Maison de la Chasse in the southern part of that insula below the red dotted line. So the properties in this block evolved a lot over the centuries. And in late antiquity, that included some extensions of their facades. You can sort of see it here at the expense of the streets. But Tébert, who made a close study of this insula, also argued that there was one encroachment here which had been overruled. And that concerns a private bath suite here in the west of the property. So let's zoom into that. So Tébert provided phased plans of these baths, showing them when they were first installed in the early 4th century, followed by a modification later in that century. And I've lined them up next to the sort of final composite plan of the insula as a whole. So Tébert reports that when what had been the apoditarium, marked with an A, was transformed into a frigidarium in the later 4th century, a pool was added to the west side, which extended out into the street. So it would have been here. But he says that pool was then carefully filled back in, which he interpreted as a response to a ruling from the local authorities. The problem for me trying to evaluate this is that this is basically the most detail that anyone has published about this pool. Tébert doesn't say anything about the dating evidence for the pool being filled in, or how it relates to the street paving, or how it relates to the entranceway shown here on the final or composite plan of the insula. So that makes it a bit hard for me to tell whether his interpretation is correct, or whether the pool was actually removed voluntarily, perhaps to make way for that entrance. I'm just mentioning it because it's the only example which even might be a case of encroachment being overturned that I've managed to track down. Obviously, if anyone knows of a more convincing case, please let me know. Okay, to wrap up, we've seen a range of examples, and a lot of the ones we can see in the archaeological record were fairly clearly carried out with the full blessing of the local council, or even with their active participation. Some, like Caerwent, probably were illicit or opportunistic. And to some extent, we can use proxies like the visibility or the expense of the building materials to tell the difference between the two. There's not much sign in the archaeological record of people objecting to encroachment, at least successfully. And that might seem at odds with the slew of legislation directed against encroachment. But in some ways, the archaeology and the texts do match up. Both certainly suggest that it happened a lot. We can also see from the texts that acting against encroachment could carry a cost for the person who did it, that frequently it took somebody with the status of an emperor to tackle it, and that agreeing to encroachment or accepting it retrospectively could meanwhile positively benefit local councils in the form of urban embellishment or an increase in tax revenue. As a phenomenon, it is definitely not unique to late antiquity. There are differences in the character of late antique encroachment, such as the situation of temples becoming obsolete. But even then, we can see the same kind of principles being applied to obsolete defensive walls at Pompeii. In both contexts, early and late, encroachment reflects the dynamic nature of cities where there's pressure on space and conflicting interests, and the way that space is used over time is subject to constant renegotiation. To go back to the vocabulary around it, I think the English encroachment and the French empiètement especially are not really very well suited to the range of situations they get applied to. Their connotations are of a sort of tentative creep forwards, which suits something like Caerwent well enough, but it doesn't match up very well with the quite blatant examples that we've also seen. I found one French scholar who, although he didn't reflect explicitly on the terminology, I noticed that he did consistently use empiètement for cases which he thought were illicit, and extension where he thought it was permitted. So he obviously felt the need to distinguish between the two. And some of the English language scholars working on late antiquity have also suggested that we ought to use a more nuanced range of terms, so that we should think about, for example, the privatization or the subdivision of space. Certainly, sites are often labelled with terms like encroachment and empiètement, without much explicit reflection on what those terms mean or what the local circumstances of the site actually are. And I also think they get applied very readily to late antique sites, and less so to earlier sites, even though the archaeology is not really that different. So it's become part of a sort of narrative of decline, and it's no wonder that it gets thought of as a late antique phenomenon when the language of encroachment is so quickly resorted to in that context. We've actually got a form of sort of circular reasoning going on around it. If I've at least begun to flag up the problem with that and to show some of what we can get out of thinking about encroachment in an earlier period today, then that's a start. Thank you ever so much for listening, and I'll be very happy to take questions.